Hey Jules, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'll be showing you guys how to sew this bomber jacket. If you want to know how to make the pattern, I'll link that tutorial below. But in today's video, I'll just be showing you how to sew it. So let's get into the video. So for fabric, I have 1.5 yards of my lining and my outer shell. So for my outer layer, I have this nice fleece fabric, and for my lining, I'm using velvet. I'll quickly go over the pattern pieces that you will need. Now to cut out your waistband, it is a little bit tricky because as you can see, it has two places that are going to be folded. So you're going to take your fabric and fold it in half the long way, and then you're going to go ahead and fold it up, and you're going to take your pattern piece and line it up with the two folded edges that line up with the folds on your pattern piece, and you're going to pin that in place and cut it out. Once you unfold your piece of fabric, you should have this long rectangle, and that is your waistband piece. Now for your other pattern pieces, for your outer shell, you're going to cut 2 sleeve pieces, 2 front pieces, and 1 back piece on the fold. For your facings, you're going to cut 2 front facings, 2 single welts for your pockets, 2 of your collar pieces cut on the fold, 2 of your insets, and 1 of your back facing. You'll also need 1 of your waistband pieces and 2 of your cuff pieces. For your lining, you're going to need 2 of your front lining pieces, 1 of your back lining piece cut on the fold, 2 sleeves, and you're going to need 4 of your pocket bags. Now to begin sewing your welt pockets, you're going to take your 2 single welt pieces and you're going to interface them with some stretch interfacing. Then you're going to go ahead and fold them in half with wrong sides together and serge that together, and it will look like this. Now I'm going to take one of my front pieces, and on the wrong side of the fabric, I'm going to iron in a square of interfacing where I'm going to be sewing the pocket just to stabilize it. Then I'm going to turn that to the right side, and I'm going to take my front pattern piece and mark a line where my pocket is going to be. And I'm going to take one of my pocket squares and line up my single welt at the top with right sides together. Then I will flip that over so that the single welt is facing the right side of my front pattern piece, and I'm going to pin that in place, lining up with the line that we marked earlier. Then I'm going to take my tape measure and mark in 5/8 of an inch on each side of my welt pocket, and I will take that to my sewing machine and sew in between those two lines at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance with a straight stitch. Once I have that sewn down, this is what it should look like. Now I'm going to take one of my other pocket bags and line it up with that line that I just sewed, and I will pin that in place. Then I'm going to go in with my tape measurer, and I'm going to mark 1 inch away from the line that I just sewed previously on the other side of my pocket bag. Once I connect all of my little dash marks, I'm going to go in and sew along that line with a straight stitch as well. Now that I have that sewn down, this is what it should look like. Now I'm going to take that one side and flip it away and pin it out of the way, and then I'm going to turn my pattern piece to the wrong side, and in between those two lines I just stitched, I am going to mark a line evenly down the center, and then I'm going to go in 5/8 of an inch on each side and mark 2 triangles. Now I'm going to cut through my fabric on that line that we just made, and I'm going to cut on those two little triangles going all the way up to our stitch lines, but making sure not to cut through them. Once I finish cutting that, I'm going to flip my piece over. I'm going to take the pins out and I'm going to pull both of my pocket bags through, and my welt pocket should start coming together and look something like this. Now I'm going to go in and give it a nice press from the wrong side of the fabric. Once I give it a nice press, I'm going to go along one of the edges and do a row of top stitching just along this edge, and I'm going to make sure I keep my pocket bags open so that I'm not sewing them together. Once I finish top stitching, I'm going to turn my front piece over, and I'm going to take my top pocket bag and line it up with the bottom pocket bag, and I'm going to sew a line of stitching along the 3 layers of my fabric. So I'm going to go through the 2 pocket bags and the 2 little corners that we cut earlier. It's a little bit confusing to explain, but if you watch the video, it'll be a lot simpler. And I'll also show you a back view of what it should look like once you sew down those 2 little corners. Once I've sewn down those 2 corners, I can now go in and top stitch the other 3 sides that we didn't top stitch earlier. Once I'm done top stitching, I'm going to go in and serge the 3 corners of my pocket bag to close it up. And now my single welt pocket has been sewn. Now I just have to go in and repeat that to my other front piece. Next, I'm going to attach my back piece. So I have my 2 front pieces laid out, and I'm going to place my back piece right sides together and line it up on the shoulder seams. And I'm going to go in and sew those together at a 1/2 inch seam allowance with a straight stitch. Once I have that all done, I'm going to go ahead and open up my front and back piece, and I'm going to press my seam allowance open so that it is nice and flat. Then I'm going to attach my sleeves. I'm going to take my sleeve piece and fold it in half to find the middle, and I'm going to match that middle point up with my shoulder seam that I have sewn together, and I'm going to sew both of my sleeves on at a 1/2 inch seam allowance with a straight stitch. Now that my sleeves have been attached, I'm going to take my piece and fold it together so that I can close up the side seams, and I'm going to pin the sleeves and the side bodice together and sew everything down at a 1/2 inch seam allowance with a straight stitch. And this is what it should look like. Now your outer shell should be all closed up, and we just have to now attach the collar. So to start, I'm going to take my 2 collar pieces, and I've interfaced both of them. And then I'm going to take them and place them right sides together, and I'm going to sew them along that top curve at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And once I do that, this is what it is looking like. Now I'm just going to go in and make little clips along the curve so that when I turn my collar right side out, it lays nice and flat. Once I have clipped my corners, I'm going to turn my collar right side out, and I'm going to give it a nice press along the top edge, and I'm going to take that to my sewing machine and do a row of top stitching along the top curve edge. Once I do that, I can now fold my collar piece in half to mark the center, And I'm going to take my main bodice and fold the top edge of that in half so that I can mark the center on that. And I'm going to match up my collar with the main bodice at the center, and I'm going to sew the collar to the main bodice at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance with a straight stitch. Now I have finished sewing my outer shell, and I can set that to the side and start sewing together my lining. So to sew my lining, I already have one of my front pieces done, but I'm just going to take my front lining and my front facing and place those two right sides together along that center seam, and I'm going to sew it at a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance with a straight stitch. Once I finish sewing those two pieces together, I'm going to take my excess seam allowance and make sure that they're both facing one side of my fabric, and I'm going to do a row of top stitching to tack my seam allowance in place. This is what my two front lining pieces look like. Now I can set those to the side and get my back lining piece and my back facing piece, and I'm going to fold those two in half and line them together evenly, and I'm going to sew that with a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance with a straight stitch. Once I finish sewing that together, I'm going to take my scissors and cut into the seam allowance, making sure not to cut through the line I just sewed, just to relieve some tension. And so once I press the seam, there's going to be no puckering, and it will lay nice and flat and be a nice pretty curved seam. Once I press my seam, I'm going to go in and do a row of top stitching to keep my seam allowance in place. And once that is done, I can go ahead and bring out my two front pieces and connect them to my back piece at the shoulder seams. And I'm going to sew those together at a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance using a straight stitch, just like I did the outer layer. And I'm going to attach the sleeves the same way by folding them in half and matching up the middle with my shoulder seam and sewing those along both of the shoulder seams at a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance with a straight stitch. Once I have sewed on my sleeves, I'm going to fold my lining in half and close up the side seams. And before I do that, I'm going to make sure that on one of the sides, I leave part of the lining open. So that way, when I connect my lining to the main piece, there's a nice little opening to pull everything through. Now to sew the waistband. Take your long rectangle piece and grab your two inset pieces and line them up on either side of the waistband. Place them right sides together, and you're going to sew both of those with a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance using a straight stitch. Now that I have my inset pieces sewn to my waistband, I'm going to set that to the side and bring out the outer layer of my jacket, and I'm going to take the bottom edge and fold it in half to mark the center, and I'm also going to mark the center on my waistband piece, and I'm going to match up my waistband with the bottom of my main shell, and I'm going to pin them together at that center seam and the two front seams. And I'm only going to pin at these 3 points because my waistband is slightly smaller than my outer shell. So as I sew, I'm going to stretch along these points and make sure that I evenly distribute the stretch from my waistband. Once I have attached my waistband, I can now begin attaching my shell to my lining. So I'm going to take my shell and my lining and match them up right sides together at the bottom edge only, and I'm going to sew that with a straight stitch using a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance. Now that I've sewn my bottom edge, I'm going to take my main piece and I'm going to tuck in the sleeves and fold my collar down. And I'm going to take my bottom piece, which is my lining, and place that right sides together along my main piece, making sure to tuck in the sleeves as well. And once I pin it together, I'm going to sew along the side seam, the top seam, and the other side seam at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And at this bottom edge, it's going to be folded in half so that the two inset pieces, the seams are going to match up. It sounds a little bit confusing, but if you see on the screen, you'll understand what I mean by matching up those two seams. So once you have everything lined up, you can now go ahead and take that to your sewing machine and sew it with a straight stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once I have everything sewn together, I'm going to go and snip these 4 corners so that once I turn it to the right side, they can be nice and sharp. And once I do that, I'm going to go through and pull everything through the little hole we left in the lining earlier. Once I've finished pulling everything to the right side, I'm going to go ahead and do a row of top stitching all along the center seam going towards the back of my collar. Once I have done that row of top stitching, I can now go in and attach my cuffs. So to attach my cuffs, I'm going to take my 2 rectangles and I'm going to fold each of them in half and serge them along that edge. Once I'm done serging that edge, I'm going to take that cuff and fold it in half so that it is a circle, and I'm going to go in and serge those 2 edges together as well. Once I have my 2 cuff pieces sewn together, I'm going to take them and attach them to my outer layer, making sure to tuck the lining in because I'm not attaching it just yet. So I'm going to take my cuff and place it right sides together along the edge of my sleeve, making sure to match up the 2 seams, and I'm going to go and sew that at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once I'm done attaching the cuff to the main part of my fabric, I'm now going to attach the lining. So it's a little bit confusing, so kind of just watch and follow along. So I'm going to take my lining piece of my cuff and I'm going to fold that edge in by 1/2 inch, and I'm going to align each of the seams from my lining and my main shell together, and I'm going to place them right sides together and put a little pin in. And once I put that pin in, I'm going to go in through that little hole that we made and I'm going to pull that sleeve through, and it should look something like this. So once you pull that through, your lining piece and your outer shell should now be facing right sides together. So you can now go in and pin it along that whole circle at the cuff and sew it at a 1/2 inch seam allowance with a straight stitch. And here's what my cuff is looking like all sewn together. Now I'm going to go through and pull my sleeve back through to the right side through that little opening from our lining. And once I do that, our sleeve cuff should now be nice and cleanly finished on the inside and the outside. Now I just need to close up that hole in my lining using a hand stitch. Now for the last part, I'm going to be installing my snaps, and I'm not going to do a tutorial on these, but I just placed 2 snaps at the bottom, and then I placed 4 more along the top of the jacket, evenly distributed so that there's an even amount of space in between each of my snaps. And now my bomber jacket is complete. It looks so dope. I really love it. And it's perfect for this winter cold weather that we are having. I hope you guys enjoyed this sewing tutorial. And if you didn't watch part 1 to make the pattern pieces, don't forget to check that out. And if you enjoyed, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss more sewing tutorials and videos that I post in the future. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you in my next video. Bye!